Welcome to Dialogues in Afrolatinidad, a podcast dedicated to amplifying and elevating Afro-Latin American and Afro-Latinx histories, cultures, and communities. I'm your host, Dr. Michele Reid-Vazquez. Join us for conversations with experts and artists to learn more about Afrolatinidad. Venga. I'm happy to welcome today's guest, Dr. Jason Méndez. He is a Boricua writer, playwright, performer, and educator from the South Bronx, New York. He received his MFA in creative writing from Randolph College and his PhD in education with an emphasis in curriculum, culture, and change from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His teaching and research interests focus on unschooling, arts as social justice, cultural studies in education, and public pedagogy. He is the founder of the Sons of the Boogie, a Bronx-based arts collective, as well as the co-founder of Block Chronicles, a national web series and online magazine profiling the work of Latinx educators and artists. Dr. Méndez is currently a visiting assistant professor of education in the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh. Thank you so much for joining me today, Jason.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So you grew up in the Bronx and now you're a professor. Mm-hmm. So how did your early life shape your professional interests in Afro-Latinx and Latinx communities more broadly?
Yeah, since you sent these questions in preparation, I was thinking about that question for so long, and thinking about how it shaped my work. And it took me back to my days in the Bronx, and I had to really think about how I experienced being Boricua in New York and in the Bronx. And then when I was 15, we moved down to Florida, Venice, Florida. And it was just a completely different world culture shock of going from the space where you're, amongst Black and brown communities. And then now you're like the sole person in a school of hundreds of kids that are, all white kids in different classes that I wasn't used to experiencing in the Bronx. And I experienced race very different that I thought was just like in the TV shows that I watched in New York. So growing up in the Bronx, the only time I ever saw the Confederate flag was when I watched like Dukes of Hazzard, not knowing the history behind that. Mm-hmm. And then moving down south, it's like it was a different meaning for the kids in school who wore Confederate flags and these racial tensions that exist. And it was just something I wasn't used to, and began to ask questions of like what it meant to be othered. And this was at 15, 16 years old, and mm-hmm. being an outsider in this space and just asking these racialized questions. And I felt very isolated in Venice, Florida. It was a miserable experience. I only lasted 2 years, and once I graduated, I left Florida. I never returned back. Mm-hmm. But I watched a lot of films, and that was, that spurred my interest in like cultural studies and representations in media. But this is back in like 95, 96. So when I was in Florida, it's like the first time I saw like a Bronx Tale. So like these conversations of race that were happening in the Bronx in the 50s and 60s. On like, different neighborhoods and Black neighborhoods and, Puerto Rican neighborhoods and Italian neighborhoods and the racial tensions there, that growing up in the Bronx, I just didn't know that history. I heard stories from my father, but didn't really know the authentic context of like what he experienced. And then, I watched movies like Higher Learning and, mm-hmm. Issues of race in higher education and, these different, how groups racialize themselves. And I just asked so many questions about race, but it wasn't until I was in grad school that I realized that I knew nothing about my Puerto Rican identity. Oh. And like I had the flags hanging in my car and hanging in my room.
Claro.
I had the bandanas. Mm-hmm. I learned how to cook. At that time I was still novice in cooking, but I did good enough to where if I had a craving for some, Boricua food, I was able to do it down south. And I listened to the music, but beyond that, I just didn't know anything of the history. And the first book I ordered online was, I have it right here, is Boricua's Influential Puerto Rican Writings, an anthology by Roberto Santiago. Mm-hmm. And what made me just think is like, I never knew about so many of these writers and artists. And why wasn't it until I was grad school that I just started to learn about this? Like, especially coming from New York and the Bronx, I was like, I should have learned who Pedro Abiso Campos was. I should have known who Julia de Burgos was and P.D. Thomas and all these artists. And so just as in grad school, I just started really focusing on, these stories of Puerto Rico, but then also racializing those stories of what it meant to be, dark-skinned Puerto Rican, because, you know, a lot of my questions started with P.D. Thomas's Down These Mean Streets. What would it meant for him to be, you know, a dark-skinned Puerto Rican growing up in Spanish Harlem? And that wasn't my experience being, you know, light-skinned Boricua growing up in the South Bronx, and just raising so many questions of the nuances of identity, and just seeing how gender and sexuality and region and language just shaped of what it meant to be Boricua, that it wasn't this fixed singular identity, and that what really spurred on all these questions of what it meant to be Boricua and Afro-Boricua.
No, exactly. That I really love the way you highlight that it's not a fixed identity, that it's fluid, very, very fluid. I know you're drawn to ideas of place and belonging and preserving migration histories, and I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about why you were drawn to these areas, especially in the evolution of your research.
Yeah, it was just funny. Like in New York, you know, I was Puerto Rican, and for more of a general term, I would always also identify either being Spanish or Hispanic. And then I moved down south, and all of a sudden, like, I'm Latino. And so like all these like words, identifiers, as like depending on what region, you know, the country you are, you get this different, you know, identity name. And so I just started to ask questions about, you know, what it meant to be Boricua, what it meant to be Latino, what is the correct identifier. And I always go back to the term Boricua because growing up in the Bronx, you know, you hear it in music, and you're always told Boricua slang, you know, for being Puerto Rican. And then I just didn't know about the post-colonial history of Puerto Rico. You know, I didn't know about, you know, the Tainos and the indigenous, you know, folks in Puerto Rico, and, you know, how enslaved folks were brought over, and that, you know, with the Spanish and the Tainos that made up the bloodlines of being Boricua. And so just all those questions of identity, and then, you know, the particularities of my work, because I'm a writer and, you know, I focus on memoir nonfiction. I know when I write my stories are not just my story. Like, I'm centralized and it's my point of view. But when I tell you my story, I tell you the story of Jose Antonio Méndez, AKA Pito, AKA Pete, you know, AKA my father, you know, who was a plumber. You know, he was an artist who had to become a plumber because he was the oldest son and had to support his other, you know, siblings in the family. His father was a plumber. You know, my grandfather, you know, his dad, Ramon Méndez, moved from Moca, Puerto Rico to, you know, New York, you know, like in the 50s. You know, that's where he met, you know, my grandmother, who's also from Moca, but they met in New York, and, you know, they lived in the Lower East Side, and, you know, he was a super. And I always joke because, you know, the story is that it was so bad in the Lower East Side that they moved to the South Bronx. And I was like, dang, like how bad was it in the Lower East Side? Where the South Bronx was like, we got to go to the South Bronx. You know, and that's where they migrated. And, you know, that's where my roots are, you know, the Hunts Point section of the South Bronx over, you know, 600 block of Oneida Street. And it's funny because now I'm reading this book for this doctoral class I'm teaching. And it's Victoria Chang's Dear Memory. And the opening paragraph, I have it here. It's about her own family history. And she uses all these documents that she's found dating back to marriage certificates, you know, and they're all, you know, Chinese documents that she's bring to her poetry. And she says, you know, to her mother, what did your mother do? What did your grandmother do? Who was your father, grandfather? And she ends by saying, it's too late now, but I would like to know. And I felt like that because my father died when he was like 51, 52 from brain cancer. And so like, I wasn't able to ask those questions. And so I'm left like piecing together pieces of my history and oral histories by talking to, like, you know, aunts and uncles and my mom and, like, you know, my one grandfather, his father, who's still living, and like trying to piece that together, that history, and just like preserve that culture. And that's just really what's central to my work, of just identity and just knowing, like, you know, where we come from.
That's beautiful. I mean, I think it's something that increasingly people are turning to try to gather those stories, you know, before people pass. But even if when they do, that there are other elements, other memories that they can collect to provide that sense of family and belonging and identity.
If you're like a family like mine, like, we share the stories, but no one in my family has documented it for like those next generations. Like, you know, I have 3 children, you know, for like my children's children, if they have, you know, their kids, if they have kids, like, how would they know that history unless it's documented? And so that's what's just the real push for my work, and just making sure as a storyteller, being able to document these stories for future generations to look back and know, like, where the Méndez line, you know, came from, or the Rivera line, my mother's side of the family, our roots, from New York to the Bronx to, back to Puerto Rico, and those stories of migration, and just like the whys, why did, my grandmother, Virginia Rivera, why did, she moved from Ay Bonito in the mountains to, the Bronx, how did my grandparents meet? And like that kind of stories of just like our history, it's very different. Like my wife's, family, like they have like family reunions like every 2 years, and they have like committees and like treasurers, and it's like, so organized, and like there's like budgets, and like there's like agendas and plans, and they plan for like years ahead of locations. And I'm like so amazed by that, because I'm like, we never do that. Like like when we have a family reunion, it's like by chance because we're all together in the same spot. And like, but they have it recorded in their history. Like they have these family trees on ancestry.com that goes back to like the plantations in which their family has histories on, and like the white families that their surname came from. And I'm just like, wow, like to have that history is so important. And it really inspired me to think about like my own family history.
I mean, and I say, it's there. It's waiting for you to complete those family trees and make those connections. And maybe you have to be the one that organizes an official reunion sometime.
I know.
I also want to ask you, as a scholar and educator, how would you say your work contributes to our understanding of Afro-Latinx communities more broadly, either histories or cultures?
In a broad sense. So I fuse my work in education, as an academic scholar, and then also as an artist, to really decenter and decolonialize how our stories are told. Like there's so much controversy on like CRT and critical race theory, and like folks who like are like, oh, shouldn't be told, like don't have a clue like what it is. And I'm like, how is controversial in terms of like telling stories from point of views that decenter historically how they're told? And so I want to tell my story from my positionality and privilege these notions of race and class, and show how they shaped, our stories. And, that's what I do in my education courses, where a lot of times I bring in prose and poetry and the nuances of language to retell our stories removed from an academic voice. A lot of times I push students to autoethnography, where it's this, biographical and ethnographical impulse that kind of intersect, because I want them to bring their stories, to whatever work that they do. Like I always share with them that your positionality is important. And when you understand your story, then you're able to connect with the communities or the students that you work with, and understand the holistic story of their experiences that go beyond the four walls of a classroom that you engage with them. Their communities, their families, the history of place. For example, in my classes here, folks do work in either Homewood or Hill District here, which, historically Black communities in Pittsburgh. And a lot of students, I tell them, know the history of why Homewood has become Homewood, in terms of like the industrialization, the displacement of Black folks in the Hill District because of the Civic Center, and how Homewood was, historically white and affluent Black communities. And there was a white flight when those displacement happened, and they settled in Homewood, folks settled in Homewood. And like know like those histories of that place. And for me, being Boricua, knowing that was so critical, because even with language is important. Like I'm not fluent in Spanish. It is not my native tongue, but that always comes up when we think about authenticity as identity. Like even if authenticity is real, like I would be called like New Yorican in a sense, being, born and raised in the Bronx. And language has always been one of those things that have, put me in a different space. Like, oh, you don't speak Spanish. And so what is that about? And I had to learn that my grandmother, when she moved from Puerto Rico to New York, she was a teacher. And so back then she taught special education, but special education when she taught was ESL. And so she taught a lot of the kids who migrated from, the Caribbean, who came over to the Bronx. And so, she would be an ESL teacher, and she saw the challenges students had navigating the system of schooling because of language. And for her, it was more of a political move to not speak Spanish at home. Right. But again, what happened is I lost that. And so my kids are even further from that. And so there's this native tongue that I'm trying to get back now, and to connect to like those roots. And so it's very political in terms of that identity, and it just shapes my work to understand those nuances of identity and positionality, and how they shape, my work as an artist and as an educator, but also like the other folks I have in class, and getting them to recognize the stories of their students and the communities that they work with and for.
Has that been Have you received any resistance to that, or have students been welcome, responsive to that?
Mo- I could probably count on one hand the time students have been resistant, and it's mostly been white students who come from this savior mentality of this community needs me. And what I try to explain to students is if this community had equity and justice, there would be no role for you in this space. And so we have to ask broader questions to that. And there's this that resistance of deficit model thinking and what you bring to these to the communities. And so in that sense, yeah, there has been resistance, but most of the time in academia, the students that I've been with, they've never had faculty of color, let alone a Boricua faculty of color. Like when I taught my first job after my doctoral program, I was at York College in Jamaica, Queens. And I loved it when I did my job talk. And it was the school I was like, I want to come here because I love these students. They just reminded me of myself growing up in New York. And I came back, and one of the things that was so astounding to me was my students were like, oh, you're the first Puerto Rican Latino professor that we've had. And I was like, man, in New York, in the school like this, like, how could I be the first? And what I represented for them was like, we could be on the other side of this. And exactly. I saw my role, instead of just being professor educator, I saw the importance of me also brokering and helping them navigate these spaces that I went through. So, you know, they could have an easier time navigating. Like, you know, I forget the verse. Jay-Z says, you know, I did that so you wouldn't have to go through that. And I felt like that was my responsibility to help students navigate that. And I saw my role a lot bigger than just being a professor, but just really a mentor and like, you know, how to navigate whiteness in higher education, because it can be draining and your quality of life can be brought down. And if you don't have the mental health and well-being and prioritizing self-care, like it can really do a lot, you know, physically and mentally. And so being that kind of support for my students is one thing I also center in my work.
That's fantastic, because that is no joke.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
I also want to ask you, what then do you think are some of the most urgent issues for Latinx, Afro-Latinx communities, especially as they relate to you and your work?
It builds off that last thing I just said, the mental health and well-being, especially more so like being in a pandemic, when you're also dealing with another pandemic that's existing in terms of race, but we've specifically seen like in Black communities and the social unrest and protests going around the country. And then you put a global pandemic on top of that. Like as a faculty member, what chairs and people who do annual reviews on your work don't realize is productivity is down because I'm now having to be like therapists and social like emotional support for my students.
Right, exactly.
And like, and then also like you prioritize like what's actually important, like this meeting or this chapter, or like my students who are like this is a for real story, and like, you know, trigger warning for anyone in terms of like, you know, suicide. But I had a student, an undergrad student, who wanted to speak with me after class and was going through a lot, and said one of his best friends, you know, tried to take his life, but because we were in quarantine and in the middle of a pandemic, he could not be there for his friend, and he was struggling with that. And so I'm looking at a curriculum and what we're planning to do. I'm like, that stuff is out the window. Like, who cares like about this paper and like this topic? And like, we can do that another time. Like, are you okay? And like me and my partner, my, you know, Darren Méndez, she's a professor in the School of Public Health. We developed the position that like, if you show up, that's good enough for me. Like, if this community is the space you need, like, that's all I'm gonna ask for you right now, just to make sure you're in the space, just to be safe and take care of what you need to take care of. And so that's been central to the work of importance, especially navigating the pandemic, you know, as a person of color or any person from a marginalized position. It's been, you know, twofold in trying to, you know, have that mental capacity to do that. And so that's just been very central to my work in dealing with mindfulness. And I went to Puerto Rico last summer for a month, and it was life-changing because I started thinking about mindfulness and impermanence, and, you know, how time is not linear and it unfolds, and what it, and we stayed in Fajardo, Puerto Rico. So if you're not familiar with Fajardo, it's on the east coast of Puerto Rico, past Luisa, which I absolutely love, Luisa. And it is very close to El Yunque. And where we stayed, we were on the
Mhm.
top floor, and we had a balcony that overlooked the mountains. And every morning, these red-tailed hawks would fly over us. And there was a connection to this ancestral history that I've never felt before.
Mhm.
And it was a renewal of spirit where you just understand the importance of what you want out of life in terms of dreams and moving forward, and just that connection. And I realized in academia, it's so built on time. Like once you enter it, you're like on tenure clock. And so it's like
Yes.
one thing
Yes.
after another. And so you
Mhm.
can't get to breathe. And the pandemic for me, I was able to be in a position where I can breathe and see like what I wanted,
Mhm.
and just to be like, I don't think academia is like what I want or where I need to be. And to have that clarity just was really important. And I now bring that to my classes. We, like my son, in the pandemic, it just wasn't a good experience. He just turned 13 last week. And so sixth grade was hard for him.
Mhm.
And so seventh grade, we were like, let's try homeschooling. Because the pandemic, for those who got children listening, like at home, when I saw what he was doing in school as an educator, I'm like, bro, this is a waste of time, man. Like, this is what you're doing. And like, we were like, you can be doing so much more in terms of like culturally relevant pedagogy and the stuff that I do with Afro-Boricua identity and Puerto Rican history and culture. Because I didn't get that until I was grad school. And like, I want him to have that, and my kids have that, as adolescents, that history. And so I adapted that same thing in my classes, where I'm like, in homeschool, you're more concerned with aptitude and development rather than grades,
Mhm.
and that kind of formal assessment. And my classes this semester, I'm like, yo, grades are out the window. Let's focus on assessment and aptitude, because it's hard to measure your progress because your starting points are all different. And so how can I say you get an A, you get an B in
Mhm.
this case? And so what it did at the end of the semester, when they did their presentations, it was like some of the best presentations I've seen students done. And one of the parts of their portfolios was like creating a vision board, and what are your goals, and how are you using this degree to go after the things you want.
Mhm.
I did a documentary recently on first generation college students in COVID. And one of the gentlemen we interviewed had mentioned how he was working this corporate job at a bank. It was one of the best jobs he had. And they talked about how he was such an asset to the company, and about promotions and raises. And then the pandemic hit and they wiped out his whole department.
Wow.
And
Yes.
yeah, and he was like, for him, he was like, I never want that to happen to me again.
Mhm.
And he started taking his hands, and he went back to school, and try to, create a more sustainable income and foundation for his family that was not based upon someone else controlling that. And that's what I try to tell my students. Like, it was told to me when I was in grad school from one of my mentors, Dr. James E. Osler, that you never really discover your full potential working for someone else. And he always promoted creative social entrepreneurship and doing your own thing. And that's like why I created Sons of the Boogie and Block Chronicles. And that's like what I try to tell my students, that like, it's great to go into the fields that you do, but like also establish your own thing where you have autonomy to control the work that you want to do and support the communities in a way they need to be supported. That's a long answer for your question. Sorry, I went on that tangent.
No, no. I mean, I think they're excellent points about finding, taking that, getting that foundational piece, and then taking that and doing whatever it is you're called to do with
Yeah.
it. That's not so dependent on all the kind of structured time demands, that are dictated by certain kinds of careers,
Yeah.
piece of
The students
possibilities.
students
Mhm.
were so stressed. I had an undergrad student, because now I'm older, so like now it's weird being in classes, because like I'm having students that are like, I'm twice their age, like they're coming from high school, and like it's like such a gap. And like even the references I use in class, they're like, what is that? And so it's this new generation of students. And so some of them, even in the pandemic, were so stressed because of grades. Even when I told them like we're not concerned with that, they still like performers like, what do you want? That whole
Right.
professor like needs to provide what he wants. I'm like, I don't have a criteria for what I want. I want what you want to create. Like that's what's significant. And they can't get over that
Mhm.
transition of high school, like being told and the expectation of like a rubric, and this is what I need to meet, versus like just create. Like this is an opportunity to be intellectually curious and to play with ideas, and get new experiences from your classmates and your peers, and move out of the bubbles that we are in and learn from other folks and their experiences. And so it's been great in that standpoint, and but just new for students and refreshing, just to kind of like take a breath.
Mhm.
And I try to provide that. I tell my students like, I know a lot of classes are a point of stress, and I hope that this is not one of them. And they're appreciative of that, to have a space to take a breath and like know, like, you know, this is a point of exploration. Like why you got here? Like, why are you at Pitt? Why are you in this class? Like, this is a means to something else. What is that something else? And like, how can I be of support to you now in order to get there?
Definitely, definitely. So I have one final question for you that
Yes.
I like to ask all of the people on the show. So in addition to your work on Block Chronicles, Sons of Boogie, and actually before I close it, I'd want to ask, can you talk a little bit more about Block Chronicles and Sons of Boogie? And
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
So Block Chronicles, it's funny, it started as a podcast back in like 2016, 2017, something like that. It was part of the public pedagogy public pedagogy component of the Latinx Education Research Hub that one of my brother's good friends, colleagues, Dr. Juan Carrillo, he founded at UNC Chapel Hill. Dr. Carrillo and I met when I was a professor at Duke, and he was at Carolina. I was the director for their minor in the program of education, and I didn't know him, and I heard of him, and we got connected through a mutual friend of ours, and I invited him over for a talk. And you know, we were the same age. You know, we had kids the same age, and he was Chicano Mexican from, you know, Compton, and I'm Boricua, you know, from the South Bronx, and here we are in, you know, Triangle, Durham, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, trying to figure out where our place was. And so far from home, and we found someone in each other that reminded us of home. And we just became like instant brothers, like talking trash of Knicks and Lakers, or playing like video games online, like dehumanizing the stuff that typically in academia, like, oh, we need to be doing research and scholarship. It's like, no, I'm gonna be playing like PlayStation right now with like my brothers, kind of thing. And we were that kind of like emotional mental health support. And he had an idea of doing a podcast about home and sharing stories of home. And we did one, and that was the only podcast episode we ever did. And
okay.
Yeah, and like we actually got a grant based upon that one podcast a couple years later, because it was a time where podcasts were shifting to video podcasts, and we were like, hey, let's start a podcast called Block Chronicles, where we go to different people's blocks and neighborhoods and talk about this idea of home. And we want to talk about educators, researchers, artists, community-based organizations, but an emphasis on Latinx communities, but we've interviewed folks from various BIPOC communities as well. And we wanted to just share those stories. Like, we were faculty and we had resources, and we want to leverage our resources to help amplify voices of work being done in very localized communities that you don't hear of. And we got a grant from the Pittsburgh Foundation and traveled the country for a year and collected over 30 interviews. Because of COVID, we haven't really released and messed up our timetable. And so that's what, you know, started Block Chronicles, and telling these digital stories about various communities throughout the country, and, you know, and even outside of the states. We're in Puerto Rico, you know, as well. So that's what we do with Block Chronicles. And Sons of the Boogie was a Bronx organization that created with my brother Sekou Gray and my mentor, the late Phase 2 artist, mentor of mine. He's a founder of the culture. When I say culture, I mean hip hop. And it started as a place to amplify his work. And Phase 2, I did my dissertation on Phase 2 and his story. And during my dissertation, what I learned from him was, he said, what is the significance of telling my story if you don't believe in the beauty of yours? And as an artist, he always believed in my work. And he always said, Sons of the Boogie is not about me, it's about us. And so that's when my artistic voice began to come through as a poet, as a playwright, as a writer. And so Sons of the Boogie is just really a Bronx collective of artists sharing our history and stories of the Bronx, but it's also wider than just the Bronx, of any community that has experienced similar to the Bronx in these urbanized spaces, and folks who are impacted by gentrification and systemic erasure, who are wanting to preserve the stories of place and of people of those places. Because when folks get displaced and gentrification, we lose those histories, and we want to create kind of like a hub of preserving those stories.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. So in addition to those pieces, and we'll have some links to those on the podcast website, what other specific kinds of resources would you recommend to people who want to learn more about the work that you're doing, about these communities? Where would you, are there any kind of films or books or other digital projects, social media organizations that you can recommend?
Oh, there's a ton. being in academia, because of the work that I love bringing in prose and poetry into the classroom, because oftentimes it's not seen as a contribution to scholarship because it's not quote unquote research. Like there's not a methodology, there's not a structure how we're used to it, but it challenges these ideas of knowledge and who can create knowledge and how we disseminate knowledge. And it's accessible in ways that most academic research is not. Like, for example, I love the story of Kali Ansting Fajardo, author of Karina and Sabrina, award-winning book, a national book finalist. She is a high school dropout, went back to school to get her MFA. I think she didn't like the program she was in, ended up going to another program, getting her MFA. And her first book won all these awards. It's now been translated in like some great, like 5-6 different languages, and it's global. And she's always posting comments and feedback she gets from mothers and daughters who resonate with her work and how significant it is to communities. And it just was so inspiring to really center the arts. And I would just recommend for folks just to engage in poetry and prose and hear those voices, those raw voices of what it's like to live in spaces that we're not familiar with and getting into that unfamiliar with. Like I have a stack of books on my desk from, you know, Victoria Chang, Dear Memory, to Olga Dies Dreaming is another one that just came out. And so I just like to just dive into like poetry and prose, specifically amongst, you know, Black and brown writers.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. Thanks for agreeing to share your first published poem with us today. It's entitled Remember the Wind, published in the July-August 2021 issue of Poetry, the oldest monthly publication devoted to verse in the English-speaking world.
Remember the Wind, after Joy Harjo. Life cycle of a dandelion. Observation. Under the warm sun, I laid a twill blanket across the lime and pear-colored grass. Near the edge of the blanket stood a dandelion. I had seen plenty of dandelions before, but never paid them much attention. And then I thought of Joy Harjo. In her poem, Remember, we are called to remember the plants, trees, animal life, all who have their tribes, their families, their histories too. And so I remember a single dandelion plant will live up to 3 life cycles. That's 3 generations of dandelions. Remembering a dandelion is not just remembering its life cycle, but remembering every dandelion cycle that's led to its germination. Stage 1. A dandelion begins life as a seedling. Each seed is attached to a single feather called a pappus, the hair-like bristles that help it fly. Carried by the wind, a seed can drift up to 30 feet before landing on soil and producing close to another 2,000 dandelions. Stage 2. 8 to 15 weeks later, the bud blossoms. The round flower head looks like a little sun. The dandelion's petals are bright yellow, and their tooth-like shapes give them their name, dent de leon, or lion's tooth. The plant's leaves grow closer to the ground, spread 3 to 10 inches across the surface, while the roots continue growing 6 to 18 inches deep. Stage 3. A mature dandelion plant produces about 12 flower stems. Each grows about 12 inches tall and produces a single bud. The flower stems have about 7 days before it dies and becomes a puffball, or what is commonly known as a wish flower. Stage 4. The flower head closes, the yellow petals fade in color, and the bud reopens into a little tiny moon of white feathers. A wish flower can produce up to 175 wind-borne seeds. Folklore superstitions believe wish flowers are dreams or messages delivered by the wind to our loved ones. Reflection. I remember the dandelion I sat next to. In a few days, its petals will fade and its bud will close. When it reopens, a wish flower, and the wind will come and carry its seeds off to begin another generation of dandelions. In the story of the dandelion, the wind is the knowing. The wind's voice can be calming, a soft breeze on a warm spring afternoon, or unpredictable and violent. Una tormenta, as mi abuelita would say. Sometimes we are the wind in a dandelion's life cycle, a breath of air making a wish, watching the seeds float away like miniature umbrellas that have folded inside out, inside us, out. Note, Joy Harjo writes, remember the wind, remember her voice. She knows the origin of this universe.
Thank you. That was beautiful.
Thank you. if you want to know how my work is shaped, like read anything from Joy Harjo. Like she's my absolute #1 favorite author. Her new book, Poet Warrior, just recently came out, her newest memoir. Like it's just beautiful storytelling. And then she tells the stories of her becoming a poet and how there's always that one person in the family, the storyteller, and it's a great responsibility. And she's that person. And through her work, I realized in my family and like my crew who I grew up with, like I was that person to document our stories and tell like our history. And like, I just love having that responsibility of being the storyteller that preserves our history.
Well, that sounds fantastic. And I will certainly have links to some of the material that you mentioned. And thank you so much, Jason, for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode of Dialogues on Afrolatinidad, please subscribe to our podcast and tell a friend. For links to the resources mentioned in the interview, visit our website at michelereidvazquez.com/podcast.